All right, welcome, friends. My name is Ian MacKenzie, founder of The Mythic Masculine, and I am joined here by two good men. And it is our task in this Substack Live to lift up the origin and the spirit and the intention of the forthcoming first annual Cascadia Men's Conference, which is going to be happening in the Squamish Valley, just north of Vancouver, in August of this year. And we're about 2 months out from that threshold, that gathering. And this conversation is, the opportunity for the three of us here, who are both, or the core stewards, myself and Trevor here, we'll introduce in a moment, along with core collaborator SIMONYUGLER here. And so before I invite these men to say hello, I'm going to spill a few words to give you a sense of them. And to all those of you who are joining us live or who are watching the recording later, welcome. And so first, one of my core stewards here with this big lift of the Cascadia Men's Conference is Trevor Mervyn. Trevor is a fellow who we've been weaving through a number of places and gatherings over the last few years. And only through this mutual desire to spark this conference have we really landed as co-stewards. And I'm delighted and better for it. And so Trevor Mervyn is a father, storyteller, wilderness fast guide, facilitates grief rituals, hosts culture tending events, and all around just a great fellow to be around. And so, Trevor, good to be here with you.
Thanks, Ian. Great to be here.
And also, I'm joined here with SIMONYUGLER, who is an internationally experienced psychedelic therapist, educator, author of the book Psychedelics and the Soul, a mythic guide to psychedelic healing, depth psychology, and cultural repair. And Simon and I, again, have known each other for a few years. I've hosted him on the Mythic Masculine podcast. We've gallivanted around with the storyteller Martin Shaw up here on his Canadian tour. And just all around, I think we're in love with many of the same mysteries, the same myths and travel, adventure, culture work. And so Simon has also joined us in our merry trio as a core collaborator on the lead up to the Cascadia Men's Conference. And so welcome, Simon.
Thank you, Ian. It's good to be here. It's good to get gallivant again together in this way.
Indeed. So again, for those joining us live, we're going to be spending about half hour or so talking about the origins and the intention, the vision and the pillars of the forthcoming Cascadia Men's Conference. And so I think it's worth speaking a little bit more too about the origins of this conference. And maybe I'll wade into that a little bit first, and then curious to hear from the both of you as we sort of linked up and joined in this shared collaboration. And so the roots of this Cascadia Men's Conference, at least for me, I mean, have been in gathering the threads of this mythopoetic lineage for some time. Though particularly, I attended the Minnesota Men's Gathering, the 40th anniversary. This was about a year and a half ago in Minnesota. And that gathering was started by Robert Bly and his collaborators in the late 80s, I believe. And when the 40th anniversary came around, I felt this instinctive call. I was like, I had to be there. I had to see what this was all about, because I heard of it for some time, felt mysterious, and yet somehow the holy ground of the origin of the mythopoetic men's lineage. And so I went. It was a profound time, in particular meeting men who'd just been on this for decades at this case, and had been lifting up story and poetry and culture work. And so returning from that, I wrote a big piece about it. It's called Where the Wild Men Are. You can check it out. Maybe I'll drop a link in the comments. And I felt like there was a spark there of like, I really want to see something like this happen on the West Coast. Trevor and I got to chatting, and maybe I'll pass it to him to speak about how he felt the call to lift this up.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Well, I'd be remiss to say that one of the main origins for me was you reaching out fairly out of the blue, I would say, to ask if I'd be interested in collaborating on building a mythopoetic men's conference in this corner of the world. I had been thinking of doing something along those lines, which I think is probably how I first came into your field around being one of the people to reach out to. but my imagination was winnowed. I could not think of doing something not on my land. So there was this whole 10-year to-do list of building a yurt and cabins and all these things. So it was just always far away. And I hadn't necessarily considered it just being a men's thing. Um, so you reaching out and just articulating this idea really sparked something in me. Um, One of my entrances into this work was certainly listening to your podcast for a long time, many years ago, as I was going through my own initiatory cauldron. And, the books that I've felt the most resonance with are mostly written from men that came out of that mythopoetic men's scene. So there's just a lot of linking swirling around there. And up until this point, most of the events that I've facilitated have been open to everyone. Um, so there was also a step for me into this, just a bit of an unknown territory, which I've, stepped into fully in the last many months in the lead up to this. And there's been a lot of big things coming up and churning around, the value of gathering in an exclusive or affinity space. So yeah, I hold a lot of the men that are, in the mythopoetic lineages as teachers. And yeah, it felt like the next step for me was to say yes to your invitation, and here I am.
Mm. Well, I'm curious as well for Simon, as one I feel like we kind of gathered each other as we went. And, I reached out to Trevor, who said yes. And then we reached out to Simon after. And for Simon, I'll just say, he's been one who I also see has been navigating through various scenes from, the psychedelic to mythopoetics, culture work, and particularly men's work as well. I mean, I know you've attended the Michael Mead's gathering a couple times, and so I also see you as one who's sort of experiencing and gathering from all these different kinds of gatherings as well, which is why it's so valuable, I think, to have you. And again, I'm curious why you felt the yes.
Hmm. Yeah, thanks, Ian. Why I felt the yes, I would say mainly is because, kind of like Trevor shared, so much of the men who have been mentors and teachers in my life, whether or not I ever met them, were people like Robert Bly and James Hillman and Michael Mead, who, we're very fortunate to still have with us. And then folks like Martin Shaw, who all of us have studied with and met, and just this tradition that has been such a kind of deep taproot of wisdom for me in my life. Like it's really forged me, it's really forged me. And I find myself, men's work, as it's known, has sort of blossomed into this kind of very like multifaceted field of all kinds of things. And to me, I often find myself reminding people that like we wouldn't have this idea of men's work if it wasn't for Bly, Mead, Hillman, Mali Domasome, these men who really kind of pioneered this movement. And currently, in my opinion, in the space of men's work and like the larger field, there really isn't a uh, space or gathering besides the Minnesota Men's Conference, which you mentioned, Ian, that really holds this tradition, that really kind of makes it a priority to continue this lineage, to kind of be connected to this thread. And so that is really, lineage is really important to me, and ancestry. And to me, it's like such a deep part of this notion of cultural repair and culture making, which I think we're all trying to do here. We're all trying to kind of invoke that and ground it in some way. And I think having that lineage connection to these men, to these conferences, to this way of approaching working with the masculine soul is what I mean. It's really important, really appealing, and really unique and special, I would say, in the
Mm.
larger field of what's currently kind of on offer in men's work.
Mm. Well, I think it's important to sketch out for those listening, for the men in particular that are curious, what is this? What happens at these gatherings, and how might it be different than these other kinds of gatherings? And first, I think it's worth reiterating that, at least in my conversation with Michael Mead, who has also been named and brought up as one of the sort of core igniters of this, is that he was very wary of the term movement, right? With the poetic men's movement, because he told me that when men move, often it's to war, right? It's to violence and destruction, and so he liked to characterize it more so as soul work, right? As men's soul work, and I think that's still a very important piece of why we're gathering, why we're invoking this conference and the pieces that we're bringing together. And I think it's also, we're saying how much it's linked to an understanding of culture work, actually. And again, even the phrase culture work, for a lot of folks who are unfamiliar with this, that may not mean very much, right? This intersection of soul work and culture work. And so I think it's worth saying that we're at a particular cultural moment where there's a lot up for masculinity, that's scrutinized, criticized. Lots of terms are tossed around. Lots of folks are wondering, is there anything worth salvaging in masculinity? Right? In fact, has it become toxic? Is it inherently toxic? How might we proceed differently in actually lifting up a different kind of mature masculinity and right relationship with our communities, with life? So it's a big question. So if a lot of men are wondering too, of like, what to do about it, right? When they see a lot of the heartbreak and the anger from women, the headlines are continual and unending. It seems like, with men behaving poorly, right? And so again, what to do about it? A lot of men might wonder. And coming together in this way at this kind of gathering is one such way. I think that we can actually do both the soul work, the personal work that is required, but also within a wider context of understanding, again, how does this actually intersect with culture? And so I felt it helpful to just kind of offer that broad frame. And I'm curious to invite in some sense of just, more like the concrete ingredients, actually, that we've assembled for this. And maybe I'll start with Trevor to speak on that.
Yeah, well, I come from a place where I believe that grief, ritual, myth, and relationship are the foundations of healthy culture. And so mythopoetics isn't a word that I generally use in my day-to-day life, although I use it a lot right now. Movement is not something I see myself involved in, because I think there's something um, to be learned from, being a bit more localized. So Cascadia is a big region, but it still is differentiated from every other region. It doesn't mean other men from outside that region aren't invited, but there's something about coming together um, in a group that is built around grief, ritual, and myth and relationship that provides a nourishment that is unavailable in spaces that are just open to everyone. Um, and of course, the healthy articulation of that is that when that group disbands, which is a part of the work. I mean, this is I take a lot of issue with, and I understand it, but, claiming that there's brotherhood and village, all these things that are created from 3 or 4 days together. It's like there is a disbanding that happens. And I think what you and I have spent a long time talking about with this event in mind is how can we gather in a way that serves the people that aren't here? Like, how can this be of service to the communities and the families and the ecosystems that the men that are coming, that those places actually benefit from their being together for that small mark of time? And I think, I don't want to throw anyone under the bus. I think there's a lot of people doing versions of this work in different ways, but the way that a lot of the gatherings land to me is it's almost like an escape or a retreat, as opposed to a encounter in a threshold space that actually, again, um, that the people on the other side of it, like the work starts then. Like men's work is a bit of a problematic term because it's so vague. And I'm certainly learning in the months leading up to this that I'm deeply engaged in men's work right now. And it's mostly in small conversations, a lot with women around, what's the point of a men's conference? And it's been very rich. And I would say that the other big part of the men's work that this event orbits around is, again, what the men do when they return back to where they come from. Because that's the difference about culture work in the modern times, is that you're generally traveling somewhere to do it. And that's a big difference. So there's got to be some version of recognizing that at the outset, that, hey, there's things that you will receive here that are actually, like, they will atrophy or be stillborn if you don't actually do something with them that is relational to your place and your family and your community. So I think that's a challenge for us to articulate that in a way that it actually lands, and to hold both ourselves and the men coming to account for that, not as a problem, but as actually a gift.
Mm. Well, maybe thank you for that too, and maybe I'll translate a little bit too. So for men are like, well, so what does that mean? What actually happens at this mysterious thing now, right? If they're feeling intimidated or it's too mysterious, I could say, again, the kind of core ingredients that make up this cauldron. One are there'll be lectures from men that we've invited to speak about key themes, and really just wonderings about different elements of what's present around masculinity today. What's at stake, right? How can we think differently, or wonder about the old myths, the elements that can offer initiatory pathways. Like that's, I think, a really key piece of maybe that's a lot different than other men's gatherings that are currently out there. So there's that element. There's afternoon workshops that we're offering as well. And workshop even is a bit of a funny word, but there are different ways of actually integrating and embodying everything that we're churning up and learning in the mornings as well. And that is everything from physical activity to connection to the land, to developing cultures of repair or pathways to accountability and repair for men as well, amongst other things. Evenings, there'll be myth telling, actually, which is, of course, a core piece of this particular tradition, poetry, grief work, ritual. So there's a lot of ingredients. And again, that feels maybe more tangible for men who are like, oh, okay, that sounds edgy perhaps, but actually kind of fun as well. And these gatherings actually have a lot of joy and depth alongside the grief and the hard conversations and the soul work. So that's the other piece I just wanted to translate, and then I'll pass it over to Simon to say, as one who's also been in gatherings like this with those kinds of ingredients as well. I'd be curious to hear, in a way, bridging between what Trevor's offered and Simon can also say about the value of these kinds of things.
Mm. Yeah, thanks, Ian. Um, yeah, I really want to emphasize what you said, which is Michael Mead's quote about men's work not being about a movement, but about soul work. And I think it was Bly actually that said that grief is actually the door into the masculine soul, because so many of us are kind of organized to achieve and go out there and get whatever you're going to get, ascent, uh, success, all these things, right? And so we can live a whole lifetime running from our grief and running from stillness and silence, and connection, And so I think this way of coming together is kind of like a slow cook, to be honest, into the fires or the waters of the masculine soul, which usually occurs through some sort of descent, or at least taking stock, taking account of the wounds, losses, griefs, heartbreaks, missed opportunities that everyone's carrying, And I think that, I mean, one thing I can say is, like, from so many women I know, there's this ask, this sense of like, please, go and do some kind of work. Please go and do your work, to the men. And my hope is that this can be a really potent doorway for that to happen, for people. And it doesn't have to look like some big kind of dramatic trauma release. It doesn't have to look like someone like pounding on the earth and screaming and crying. Sometimes things like that happen. But I think the mythopoetic angle here is that, at least in my experience, it can be a lot more slow and subtle and occur through things like poetry and occur through things like story, so that these kind of very ancient art forms, we steep in them together, often in kind of deep listening and silence, and we let the medicine of the poems, we let the medicine of the stories work on us, and we come together around that process. Um, which I think I find to be just such a honestly like gentle and very beautiful way of working with the masculine soul.
Hmm. Well, it's worth, I think, speaking to some of the pillars that we've assembled, again, to speak more to the intention of our gathering. Because, again, with the question of how is this in service, or what are we holding as the the intentions or the elements that matter to us in the ways that we gather. And so I'm going to turn it over to Trevor, I think, to kick us off. We have a number of pillars on our website, which we've assembled, and maybe to speak to a couple that feel important to you to name.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. First, just to tag on to the previous question, I think it's important to mention that we're gathering in nature as well. So there's a big difference to gathering to do this type of work in a church basement, which is where my men's group meets. No problem with that. But the Chikima Center, which is where this is being held, it's 400 plus acres of rainforest. It's got a river running right through it. And yeah, it's not in the deep wilderness like how a lot of the, um, before modern times, this kind of gathering would take place in. But it's close enough. So having these ritual and grief experiences beneath trees and beside rivers deepens it, because tapping into the grief of the ecological grief is a part of being a mature human being in this culture. So I think that's a big part of it too. And then in terms of our pillars, I think the one I'll speak to is what we've titled relational diversity and affinity, and that's just really, again, sitting with this question of the question and articulation of the value of separation, temporary separation. So there's a difference between alienation and separation. Alienation is how you feel about separation, or can be how you feel about it. But separation is fairly inherently natural in the natural world. Um, Traditional cultures had and have men's work and women's work and hunters' work and weavers' work and elders' work, and it's not. And those separate groups coming together create the tribe or the culture, and the health of the separate groups is reflected in the health of the culture or the unhealth. It gets edgy for a men's conference is the difference between a non-marginalized affinity group meeting and a marginalized affinity group. So again, that's something that we need to, as stewards and as hosts and as men doing this work, like hold that up as a just not a byproduct or a thing to bypass, but okay, like what is the healthy articulation of us meeting, and how does there's a saying I quite like that says healthy power empowers. So there's other affinity groups out there, whether they're women's groups or any other group that isn't the little specific group that we're in. Like, how can they benefit by our group actually returning to health, and knowing that part of our role as an affinity group, and wherever you draw the line, in this case, it's just men, so it's fairly broad. Um, but there needs to be a lot of consciousness there on how the other people in our communities are served by us gathering, as opposed to this being an escape or a retreat. Um, taking time off from the family and the work and just like, oh, nice, hang out in the woods for a few days. I mean, it doesn't mean that it, like you said earlier, it can't be fun. It doesn't mean that it's not going to be like a nice time, but like there's other things in the mix. And I'm a very staunch advocate for affinity group work, and I actively support other groups meeting behind closed doors temporarily, knowing that when the bigger groups come together, like it's that separate work that actually contributes to the health of the bigger group.
Mm. Yeah,
Yeah,
thanks,
and
Trevor.
that's where
Simon. Good.
let's jump in. Like that's where I would say like deep diversity comes from. So again, diversity is another word that gets thrown around all over the place. But there's a difference between diversity that's like checking boxes and diversity that actually supports differentiation and differences, so that when you're coming together, it's not erasing differences, it's recognizing them, and that the differences are actually have another space to be articulated in, so that the coming together can actually be healthy and not bend everything down.
Awesome. Yeah, and Simon, I'm curious as well, what sticks out for you in terms of the pillars that we've assembled?
Um, yeah, I think the three that feel really close to home for me are the very first one, which is just the notion of healthy masculinity, you know, and it seems like really important and yeah, but kind of like the crux of what, we're trying to gather around, the crux of what I'm hoping that men kind of take away from experiences like this. Like kind of Trevor said, it's not just about 3 nice days in the woods, but like, how are you showing up to the people waiting for you? How are you showing up to the world once you leave? So to me, that's all about this notion of healthy masculinity and again, that notion of cooking, like some things need to be kind of cooked down or cooked out. And I think there's a place, a pretty significant place that men's work can occupy and a role that men's work can occupy in cooking that, cooking some of these elements of the masculine psyche that need to be refined and worked through, you know. And traditionally, I would say, um, that might happen through this process we could call initiation, which is another one of these pillars. Um, and I think I love that we say like this is not an initiatory event, right? This is not an initiatory threshold. Um, but I think all of us are drawing on this notion of the importance of rites of passage and rites of initiation for men in particular and the gaping hole in our culture by the fact that we don't really have those anymore. And so I think so much of what people and especially men seek in larger spiritual circles, whether if it's um, psychedelic experiences and ceremonies, or travel, or relationship, even can be that initiatory threshold where you do get cooked. You do have to face something usually difficult and unexpected, or at least unknown, right? And you come out the other side changed, blessedly scarred, um, opened to a dimension of life and a dimension of soul and a dimension of culture that you previously were not opened to. Um, and yeah, I think that, like I said, grief and praise is another one of these pillars that feels very close to home, for me personally. And I think just it's like every day is sort of a new opportunity, it seems, in these times to confront a layer of grief, whether that is personal, whether that is ecological, whether that is collective, sort of like pick your pick your grief, you know. Um, and so yeah, all of that feels really
Mm.
close to home for me, and things that I can really support, like really support all those things. So,
Mm. Well, thanks for that. I feel as we wind our conversation to close, it's worth spending a little bit of time on the theme for this year, because every conference, this is one of the traditions of the Minnesota group, is to offer up a theme, which helps to orient the time that we gather around. And so, Trevor, I'd love for you to hear or to speak a little on the theme that has been chosen for this year and why.
Sure. Thanks, Ian. Well, the theme that we're gathering around is courting the divine spark. And this comes directly from the story that will be told on our first night together. Um, and the briefest synopsis is that in the rites of passage work that I do, I've recognized over and over again that, especially once you're, again, traditionally you'd be doing rites of passage work when you were 15 or something. Uh, in modern society, it's adults that make the decision to do it. So it's debatable whether rites of passage is the right phrase, but that's a different conversation. However, the thing that comes to you as a person in your 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s in a threshold experience is not brand new. It's familiar and recognizable. And it's something that came to you when you were younger, probably at 14 or 15. And there's a lot of grief in that, of course, because at the time you weren't able to say yes to it. Um, so there's a lot of empowerment in that because there's a relationship there. Um, Story gets into this, divine being comes to this young man and recognizes him, knows who he is, and lets him know that they're actually betrothed, and all he has to do is return to the same spot tomorrow in the middle of the sea, and they'll live happily ever after. And of course, he does that 3 times because it's a folktale. Um, and through various reasons, he's not able to stay awake. There's been a spell cast on him, and he spends what in the story is 2/3 of the story, what in a life could be 2/3 of a life, um, trying to reconnect with this divine spark, for reunification that in folk tales is often a marriage. But again, the literal translation of that is not a man and a woman getting married. This is a reunification of something that, again, in the case of this folk tale, in the case of so much of this work, is something that reached out to you a long time ago. And because of the distractions and all of the pressures of just being a person in the modern world, like you just miss it, but you do recognize it. And there's, like any relationship, there's work to be done to repair. And this is why we use the word court. It's not capturing that essence. It's not trapping it. It's not training it or changing it. It's courting it. And if you've ever tried to court somebody, poetry has probably been involved, maybe a very bad poetry, depending on what stage of life you're in. But there's a real big difference between seeking and running after something and courting something. So it's a real deftness, and there needs to be a lot of grace, a lot of grief, and some forgiveness. And that's what gives the rise to the possibility of a reunification into what I would just say wholeness that is temporary. Because of course, this is how these cycles work. So it's not that, again, working with this conference and this weekend and everything's going to be sorted, but it helps lay the groundwork for that divine spark in each man's life. That I think most of them will recognize what that is.
Mm.
Mhm.
Thank you. And Simon, is there anything you want to add about the theme as well, the courting of the divine spark?
I mean, I love it, like, I think of it in terms of kind of creativity in a sense, like in order to be creative, whether if that is through a business, whether that is through art, poetry, whether that's even just sort of like um, being creatively involved in the world, I think is kind of a core um, element of being uh, a man. Is somehow creating something in the world, and we live in such an interesting, weird, somewhat terrifying time in terms of creativity. I'm thinking specifically of AI and what it's doing to writing and music and imagery and arts and all these things. Um, and creativity, I think we're going to see more and more will become a necessary and rare and even sacred conduit back towards our humanity. And we can't be creative unless we're connected to that divine spark, and unless we're connected to ourselves and really connected to what we could call the deep soul. So this story is just about one person's journey to court that and reconnect with that, which as Trevor said, might take 2/3 of a life.
Mm, beautiful. Well, I think it's worth saying again an invitation to the men who are leaning in, perhaps intrigued. If you're brand new to men's work, if you've never heard of men's work, but somehow this is calling you forth, then please feel invited. This is of course, the Cascadia Men's Conference. This will be happening in the Squamish Valley, August 6th to 9th. There'll be a link in the chat and the show notes as well for you to go check out the website. Tickets available there. And it's worth saying that, I mean, we gather together for these 4 days, but also you'll be well fed. There'll be beautiful meals provided throughout the time together. You'll be staying on site in indoor accommodations, not a camp out. It's actually all within the infrastructure, also embedded within nature as well, as Trevor named. And so even men who've been in men's work for a time, or maybe very familiar with the mythopoetic lineage, know Iron John like the back of their hand, King War, Magician Lover, all this stuff. If you feel like maybe you've done that, maybe that era is over for you, perhaps reconsider that actually there's a real value in revisiting the wellspring of this with a new generation that also, we're doing our best to lift up both the teachers of the past and their contributions, as well as to bring other pieces, that we've gathered, that we've learned from, and to, reconnect the generations, because that's so much a part of it. Of course, the intergenerational medicine that is apparent when we gather. And it's worth noting that two of the sort of longtime participants and creators of the stewards of the Minnesota Men's Gathering, will be joining us actually as well. We've invited them to come, Miguel Rivera and Walton Stanley. They'll be there at our conference to help us light it up here on the West Coast, along with many others, luminaries and wisdom keepers and guides to really, bring together, I think, something that'll feel still challenging to articulate, but I think will be a particular kind of magic that at least, I experienced, I think we've all experienced in these different kinds of cauldrons, that, afterwards there's a real sense of like, wow, that was something and that mattered. And again, this is the first year to really plant the seeds of further gatherings to come. And so is there any other invitations you want to make? Anything else you want to say to the men or even to the women listening as we close this conversation today?
I'll just say, men's work can take a lot of different forms and take a lot of different shapes, and it may not look like you think it is supposed to look, just like masculinity and manhood might not look the way that you think it is supposed to look, right? And so, yeah, that's what I'll put out there, is that if you have an idea of what this is about, or what men's work is about, or even what masculinity is about, you may be pleasantly surprised by what you find. So,
And Trevor?
Yeah, I'll just return it again to, after the weekend, I think it will be noticeable in the men that something has happened. And the real marker of whether this conference does what we intend is that the people in their lives will notice that something happened. And then that needs to be tended. So there's a real, one of the pillars that we're going to get to is elders, elderhood as practice. So we've put together an advisor board of elders that we've been reaching out to. And at the conference, there'll be some specific offerings around, especially on the last day, around the elders present, because this is something that, us youngers reaching out to older men to ask what they see, and especially what they see is missing, is actually how elders are made. So that's something that I think by putting that into practice and at the event, like that in itself could have some really powerful ripple effects out in people's communities, because it really does, like, asking for help can be really difficult as a man. And we've been asking for a lot of help and we'll continue to do so. And would it be that some of the pieces that we're bringing together actually can inspire those small little intermittent changes in other people's locales, to just really for the health of the culture and for the ecosystem. Like, men need to be healthy for the culture and the environment to be healthy. There's just no doubt about that.
All right, gentlemen. Believe we'll close it there for now. So once again, appreciate your time coming together like this and lifting up the upcoming Cascadia Men's Conference. And to those who tuned in live, thank you for joining. To those that'll listen as well. And, one last invitation is to share this. If you're moved by this, if you're curious, if you think this has value, to share this interview, to share the website with your network, with your community, with the men that you think may benefit, because it absolutely is only possible with the support of you to help amplify, to help ripple this out so that this has a chance to really to mean something and to lift up, some kind of the necessary work that's needed today. So I'll leave it there for now. Thanks, gentlemen.
Thank you. Bye for now.